It's an absolute privilege and a pleasure to speak to you today about the exhibition that we're staging at the British Museum, which Karenza so beautifully introduced, albeit 10 minutes ago rather than a minute ago. We're really, each curator at the British Museum has maybe one chance to present an exhibition to the public, one chance in their British Museum life, and this is my opportunity, and it's a real privilege, but it's also a big responsibility. And what I would say is it's not at all possible to stage an exhibition on this scale with over 35 lenders, over 400 objects, without a huge team of people inside the museum. Those people have been building Stonehenge. They have been erecting a double oxen cart burial. They have been mounting beautiful goldwork. And each one of those individuals is so incredible at their jobs, and it makes it such a privilege to work in a museum. Any museum around the UK has the same depth of skill, and much of it underappreciated. And I think I want you to say up front that no exhibition that you ever visit is possible without this real community of practice. And I think that really reflects what happens in archaeology more widely. The other thing is that we couldn't possibly do an exhibition like this without our partnership museums and colleagues across the UK and the Republic of Ireland and across Europe. And it's been so heartening that despite the really tough times that we find ourselves in and have found ourselves in, lots of colleagues, lots of museums around the UK and Ireland and Europe have come to our support really in staging this show. And I think, again, it's not possible to stage anything like this without demonstrating the strength and depth of the collections and the museums that we all know and love from our various parts of the UK. I'm really grateful to them as well. But really, this is a show that starts and has at its heart Stonehenge. And I think many of us feel that we know Stonehenge, and many of the public who are not archaeologists also feel they know Stonehenge. Many of them drive past it on the A303, of course, and have opportunity in heavy traffic to have a good look. Others visit once maybe in their lifetime on a school trip, but yet it's ingrained within our sense of being part of these islands, if you like. And yet, the truth is that what do people really know about it? The time in which it was built, and more importantly for archaeologists, what do people know about the people who built it? And those are all questions that really underpin the reason why we wanted to do this exhibition. And the exhibition is really about unraveling the meaning of Stonehenge by setting it in its fuller context, by describing the times and the places in which Stonehenge meant something. So our thesis is that you can't understand Stonehenge without understanding the world that sort of brought it into being, without understanding the communities who thought it was a good idea to build it. Those are the people, those are the sort of aspects of this time that we're trying to get across in the exhibition and in the objects that we're displaying in the exhibition. But having said that, Stonehenge itself and objects from not just the monument, but its wider landscape, which as we know is so rich and so full of new discoveries, those objects form a spine, if you like, a thread that runs through the exhibition and allows the visitor to sort of find a touchstone, something they're familiar with, a monument that makes sense to them, despite the fact that many people visiting won't be overly familiar with prehistory, deep history, or indeed with archaeology. But why Stonehenge and why now? Those are the questions I get asked all the time. The truth is that Stonehenge is, as I've said, a gateway into this time period. And the only other exhibition that's ever been staged really on anything like the scale that we're trying to achieve was up in Edinburgh in 1984 and 1985. And that's the Symbols of Power exhibition. And it has a lasting legacy on us as archaeologists, particularly on prehistorians, not least because of its fantastic catalogue, which was full of the most beautifully achieved and realised photographs of objects from the time of Stonehenge. its thesis was very much also of its time, and that was one of individuality, of the rise of individuals, but also of individual objects as sort of like art pieces. The way they're photographed in the catalogue makes you really kind of feel how tactile and how beautiful these objects were as kind of objects of art. And that was a really important land. That was a really important landmark in the history of how we present prehistoric objects or any type of object in museums. And I would argue that there's a direct line that could be drawn from Symbols of Power by David Clark and colleagues, and the 100 Objects project that was undertaken at the British Museum by Neil McGregor. That really, Symbols of Power kicks off that whole move towards having one object as symbolic of or capturing something of the world or the essence of the times in which it's situated. In our project, in our exhibition, we're trying to move things on a bit. While individual objects are so important and so critical, we also want to embrace the bigger assemblages, the sites, the stuff, not just the individual special gold find that you find on your site, but the material culture in its almost entirety, if you like. And we can't do that in an exhibition, but we've made the best attempt we can not to just pick individual objects, but show the wider context in which they're situated. And for us as a museum, that's a big departure. But for archaeology, I think it makes sense. And I hope there's a sort of agreement that that's something that's been missing from a lot of exhibitions at the British Museum to this point, a sense of the richness of the archaeological assemblage. And that's something we try to achieve. Also, the fact that it's not just about gold. It can be about more humble but equally powerful objects. That's something we've also tried to build into the exhibition. So you'll see lots of organics, or what's preserved in organic material, trying to make that point that what we're missing is really the organics, that is the tissue between the bone and the stone and the metal, the vibrant and important tissue between those more enduring materials. And as Carenza mentioned in the introduction, we've been really struck by the reception that we've had already in the previews around the newspapers in Britain and beyond, in the continent as well. And what struck us is that we appeal as an exhibition to different audiences. And to us, that's really important, because we don't want to just talk to the art historians. We also want to talk to people who have a limited knowledge or even interest at this point in archaeology. And we want to open up a world for them to explore, as well as the specialists, as well as people like us who love archaeology. We want to bring in new audiences. And I think that's what I'm minded of when people say that Stonehenge is something that's perhaps done or overexposed. Those are fair criticisms, but we must also remember that to the wider public, it's a really exciting point of light that we can use as a way of sort of kicking open the door and exposing a wider world and a wider range of sites and landscapes that we have across Britain and beyond. The exhibition itself, though, covers some of the big moves in deep history and prehistory. So in the exhibition, people will find out about the introduction of farming and just how radical and important that is. They'll also find out about the changing nature of the monument, the idea that there's not just one Stonehenge, which many people understandably think, but many different phases, many different spaces, and many different contexts for the monument. And then they'll also find out about that transformational moment 4,500 years ago, when migrants from Europe come to Britain and introduce this new ideology, the Beaker people, new ideology of single burial, of metalwork, and of a new religion. And then the impacts, the knock-on effects of that in terms of standardization, cross-channel trade and exchange. We'll explore all these things and take the narrative full circle. So while Stonehenge is at the heart, we're really looking to bookend it. What happens before Stonehenge? What happens after? And why is that relevant to today? Those are all things that the exhibition addresses. And really, in light of COVID, we want to also make the point that this was an age of connectivity. These weren't static people locked on to their Zoom cameras, as I am. These were people who were really deeply embedded in their landscape and had these connections with land that changed with the introduction of farming from hunter-gatherers to more settled people, but also to people who viewed land in different ways, who saw property and time in different ways in that landscape, but also people whose ideas of cosmology changed in the course of the years that we're looking at, the centuries we're looking at, and how important the sun was in guiding and giving a tempo and a timing to life. And then interactions and connections between people, how important they are, not just with the ancestors, but also between communities. That idea of cross-channel trade being something that's not a dry economic exchange, but something that's bound up in social, religious, and even cosmological principles. And so to do these things, we have an exhibition that's separated into 6 areas, 6 parts. And what I wanted to do in the time that I have is to go through each section and give you a flavour of how the objects work, how archaeology has been built into the exhibition narrative. And of course, at the beginning and end, we have this idea of the sun and this cycle. And it's a very immersive exhibition. I've been down there, and there's people that are transfixed by this installation of the sun that we've built at one end of the hall. And even some people asking me if people are going to come and worship the sun. I told them that I wasn't sure, but that I certainly would, particularly having been sort of stuck in the museum and not seen natural light for about 6 months. So to begin at the beginning, in the beginning of the exhibition, we take the narrative back to the hunter-gatherer story, to this idea of a people who are much more in tune with nature. And many of you will know about the excellent finds from Car that have been found not just recently, but back in the mid-20th century onwards. And so we'll present the Car frontlet that's been a staple of our collection for so long, but we'll juxtapose it with something quite different. And that's an antler headdress from another part of Europe, a Europe that at the time these headdresses were being worn was connected, when Doggerland was present and when there was no water between Britain and Europe. And we'll contrast Car with this astonishing burial of a woman in Germany called the Bad Durenberg shaman. And she was buried with the most amazing objects. And what we focused in on is the headdress, which is obviously the roe deer antler, but also the teeth of bison, of wolves, of wild animals from around the landscape. And the point we're trying to make with her story is that it's not just in Britain that you have these antler headdresses, it's right across Europe that you find them. This is a connected world, even before Stonehenge is constructed. Just to give you a sense, with the black dot showing the find spots of these antler headdresses in a connected Europe. But of course, the landscape of Stonehenge, even though there weren't any stone monuments, was already seemingly important, perhaps as the work of Mike Parker-Pearson has shown, because of these geological marks in the landscape even, but it was nonetheless marked out in these Mesolithic hunter-gatherer times with these pits or posts that were raised in the landscape. But then we move into this period of transformation, of the first farmers coming from the continent and bringing with them farming. And to represent that, we show a beautiful group of jadeite axes, not just our one from Canterbury, but loans from across the country that I think are really going to catch your eye if you visit. These are astonishing objects that really have to be seen in the light to really do them justice. They sparkle. And they represent that movement of continental farmers into Britain, bringing with them not just ideas, but the material culture of this new way of life. These objects of sort of seduction, sort of a slice of Italian style being brought into Britain with these new ideas. And then just to give a sense of that landscape, the idea that these objects were quarried from the high Alps, the idea that they were from near to the sky, near to the heavens, and they're brought down and moved over these long distances until they were ultimately deposited in parts of Britain. And of course, Britain has its own answer to the jadeite axe, which is the Langdale tuff, the greenstone that's a kind of echo, if you like, a British echo of that European notion, and that itself comes from a mountain peak. The Langdale Pike, of course, so much work has been undertaken here to provide a quarry provenance for these greenstone axes. So we tell the story of those echoes between Europe and Britain and these beautiful, beautiful axes. We show that against the backdrop of not just the special axes, but of the assemblage of axes that the British Museum normally has in deep storage. We're bringing those out, and we're doing something quite special with them. And I don't want to ruin the surprise for those that may be able to visit, but I think what we've done with 100 axes is really quite a special thing. And it provides that sense of a community, of not just individuals with special axes, but of a community of farmers who are transforming the fortunes and the landscape of this country through deforestation, but also through the building of monuments and new landscapes. And a flavour of those new monuments being Stonehenge 1, of course, the blue Stonehenge, when the stones are brought from Wales. And of course, so much work has recently been done by Mike Pitts of British Archaeology on the sort of logistics and the story of how the bluestones ended up at Stonehenge. And that's amazingly well told in Mike's new book that we were very lucky to have sight of while we were building this exhibition. And really, the point we're trying to make is that the bluestones really are part of the story that we're telling with portable objects, because that idea of stone being so important to your sense of ancestry and self and identity that you would move it over long distances, that story that we tell through the act is the story of the bluestones also. So we're trying to connect up monument, portable objects in a way that makes sense to the visitor. But we also are able to bring from Salisbury Museum, thanks to their very kind cooperation and partnership, the key finds from the Aubrey holes, from that Stonehenge 1, so the objects that were placed with the cremated dead in that first bluestone monument are coming to the exhibition, along with the Bowles Barrow bluestone, which, as many of you might have read recently, is now we think is much more likely to be a piece of Stonehenge than a monument that's at Bowles. So a piece of Stonehenge will come in the form of a bluestone, we think, and also the finds from that bluestone phase of the monument will be represented. And in the second part of the exhibition, we explore how that monumental world is transformed by the late part of the Neolithic, when this new art and shared culture is found at the ceremonial landscapes that are not just in Wessex, but up in Orkney. They're in Forteviot in east central Scotland. They're in the Millfield Basin in Northumberland. They're in the Boyne Valley, Bruna Boyne as well, astonishingly well preserved at Newgrange, where you can go into the passage at midwinter and watch the sun fill the chamber, reuniting the living and the dead. And we follow this story through the art of the objects. And we've got an astonishing case that we just installed that has all the mace heads of this type and brought together for the first time, I think, including the most astonishing of all of them, the Knowth mace head, which looks, to my mind, although the mind is obviously geared towards these things, to be a human face that's almost screaming out at us, the shaft hole being the mouth, the beard and the hair on top, and the iconic swirls of eyes. Even if it's not a human face, it speaks to us. It is an object of awe, with a look of awe, and it looks wonderful in the way we've been able to show it. So introducing this idea of a shared art that's undertaken on objects that are separated by long distances and in which the local communities have their own agency. So in East Yorkshire, we famously make these beautiful chalk drums instead of mace heads or carved balls. And the Folkestone drums are looking resplendent in their new context of being surrounded by all these other wonderful portable objects. The chalk drums were famously buried with a child, as if they were accompanying that child or protecting it. They were sort of placed around the body. And Michael Rosen has written a beautiful new poem a year or two ago about these chalk drums, and that will be part of our programming around the exhibition as well. And then in northeast Scotland in Orkney, their take on this new art is the carved stone ball, and we have over 20 of these really enigmatic objects. And the point we're trying to make with these is that these people were not unsophisticated. These people were exploring stone in the way that people like Barbara Hepworth was exploring stone, really following its properties, exploring its qualities through the carving of these objects. So we don't have to know what their function was to appreciate them as beautiful things, as objects that you want to hold, as very tactile things. And so those two will be part of that exhibition. And then the idea of art, not just portable, but in the home. And we've been really lucky, thanks to Nick Cardi and Anne Mitchell and his and colleagues up in Orkney, to be able to borrow objects from the Nessa Brodgar, decorated objects from there that will be displayed for the first time in the exhibition, to give a sense that it's also in the home that people were encountering these artistic motifs that had so much meaning, even though we can't quite pin down that exact significance. And then we turn our minds to what happens next, to the sarsen phase of the monument, when there's this real focus on the solar alignment of the monument, and it's very much aligned on the midwinter and midsummer sunset and sunrise. That forms the next part of the exhibition. And to explore that, we can't bring Stonehenge itself. We tried. English Heritage weren't so keen on us putting a temporarily removed sign on the monument, so we decided not to. But what we have been able to bring, I think, is just as important and has somewhat slipped a little from public imagination, despite the work that Time Team did on this site, and that's Stonehenge. We're bringing 50% of the monument to the British Museum. The other 50% will be on display in King's Lynn throughout the run of the exhibition, so people can see both halves of the story, if you like, at King's Lynn and at the BM. That's really important to us, that regional museums are benefiting from what we're doing. And so half the monument will be there, and we've aligned it on our sun installation so that the sun shines through or rises and sets through, I should say, the entrance of this monument, as it did, or reflecting as closely as we can, the way it did when the monument was first built on the coast of Norfolk. And the timbers are looking absolutely wonderful. And we've been able to conserve quite a few more timbers to the ones that are on display in Lynn. So they're able to go back and form more of a complete circle at King's Lynn, hopefully at some point in the future. And we've been working closely with the artist Rose Ferraby and her colleague Rob St. John on a soundscape for Stonehenge. And I can't wait for people to hear it, because it's a really immersive, imaginative soundscape. Not the sort of thing you normally hear in a British Museum show, but one that takes it to the next level and really explores the archaeological nature of the site, what you hear there today, what you hear underground. It's really quite an experimental piece. And she's also done this wonderful piece of art that reminds me of sort of John Piper, really lovely reflection on the monument. So an new artistic angle on Stonehenge as part of the exhibition. And then we follow the roots of that central stump in the middle of Stonehenge, which was turned up towards the sky. We follow that upwards into the next section, which is looking at the heavens and the importance of cosmology to people's lives. And one of the star objects in this section, which is blacked out, dark and atmospheric, is the Nebraska Disc. And this is a star loan by any measure from a museum in Halle. First time it's been to the UK. And I won't go into too much detail, that's all laid out in the show and in the catalogue on what the disc shows, but needless to say that it's a kind of portable version of Stonehenge. It inscribes astronomical knowledge. It also, in the gold bands on the left and right, inscribes the solstice, sunrise and sunset through the course of a year. So you're taking something that used to be laid out in stone circles and timber circles, and you're making it into something portable. And in the exhibition narrative, what we're saying is that the introduction of metal has this kind of seismic shift in what people do with portable objects. And that's not least because gold, from the very beginnings, it seems, particularly in Britain and Ireland, gold is associated closely with the sun and with its power. And that's the point we make in an astonishing display of lunula. We're getting all the lunula out and borrowing several more. So really you're going to see a wall of glistening gold lunulae, these gold collars from the very early Bronze Age. And one more point is that in some ways this is a bit of a coming home for the Nebraska Disc, in the sense that the gold that was used to decorate it was probably mined in Cornwall and then exported to Germany, where it was built into this object. So again, the idea of this long distance connectivity that's really sort of celebrated in these objects and in this exhibition. Just to make that point, that the gold bands really captures a very particular setting and rising of the sun at this point in Germany where the disc was made, much as in previous centuries, generations, monuments like Stonehenge did the same job. And also, there wouldn't be a section on cosmology without some astonishing gold hats. And we have two of these in the exhibition, and they are really, along with the mold cake, they are astonishing pieces of clothing, if you like, of dress. And yeah, there's a lot of debate about whether they perhaps are also encoding astronomical knowledge. I'm not entirely convinced, and we haven't suggested so in the show, but what we do suggest is that individuals wearing these objects were able to align themselves with the power of the sun in religious and in social life, the two obviously being closely interconnected. And the gold lunula that I mentioned from that early part of the Bronze Age, closely associated with the sun. And then from the very end of the Bronze Age, these gold gorgets or collars, which are really the same idea as the lunula, but over 800 years later. So a really astonishing time depth of using the same symbols, the same idea, the same beliefs. And we're exploring that, the way that the sun permeates the whole sort of period that we're exploring in this exhibition as a guiding light in religious and social life. We're also exploring in this section the cosmology that's found in the northern part of Europe. Some of you will know that in Scandinavia they have these astonishing objects that represent the sun cycle, the Trondheim sun chariot being the most famous. We can't borrow the sun chariot, but we are borrowing objects that show the sun horse. These gold cups from the Marismindi hoard have the head of a horse that was closely associated with the path of the sun across the heavens in Scandinavian cosmology. And then new archaeological discoveries as well. This new hoard from Denmark at Kallerup, showing a horse and snake hybrid, a ceremonial axe, and then the two-headed, the twin gods that were a key part of Scandinavian cosmology. So I think we're going to really impress people with the sense that these ideas of myths that you can pin down, and you tend to think of those as being Mediterranean or Celtic, but actually they predate that world, and we're going to explore that as well. But then in the second last part of the show, we come back down to earth with a bump. And what we explore here is the way that the monument significance shifted from an active site being messed around with and rebuilt to one of a cemetery. So the use of the wider landscape for burial. And we're bringing a number of individuals who we introduce our visitors to this part of the exhibition, which is like a barrow cemetery in its design. And so you'll meet the Amesbury Archer, who famously made that journey from the foothills of the Alps to be buried with this ceremony of great objects and relatively close to Stonehenge itself. But we'll also be bringing the two of the stelae statues from the sort of area that the Amesbury Archer probably came from in the foothills of the Alps. These particular ones are from Sion in Switzerland, and they show archers wearing this sort of beaker textile. So of the time of the Amesbury Archers, it dates to the same period. The people that they were raised in memory of outside the tomb may even be from the same community or a related community to the one that the Amesbury Archer came from. So the British, I feel really lucky the British Museum has this ability to bring these objects from across Europe and sort of reconnect these families, these ancestors in a way that's possible only in a big show like this. So great to be able to do that. And then moving on a few hundred years, Stonehenge becomes that fulcrum of some of the most elaborate burials of anywhere in Europe, of people who are so closely connected to other communities in Europe. Bush Barrow, you look at those daggers and think, my goodness, these are people that are closely connected to what's happening in France and even in the Mycenaean world in terms of the gold pin technology. So individuals who are powerful by their connections, but also powerful because of their ability to control the access and flow of metal across Europe. And that's really the story of the final part of the exhibition. where we explore this increase in trade and exchange between the south coast of England and those communities along the south coast and communities in Northern Europe and France. And we show here the shipwreck from Langdon Bay, normally on display in Dover. They're very generously allowing us to borrow some of it back. We have it on long-term loan, or some of it back to show that that frequent trade exchange between both sides of the channel. But also with that trade and exchange, unfortunately, comes new tensions. And what we explore is the idea of warrior identity, and the fact that it's not just the Mediterranean classical world that gets these amazing sort of Homeric moments of warriors in the Brad Pitt Troy fashion, dressing up and sort of parading. It's not just the Mediterranean and the Homeric world that has those. Northwest Europe does too. And we want to make that point. Just because the stories are not written down or passed down through oral tradition doesn't mean that we didn't have a similar situation up north, as it were. So we show some of those objects, but we also show the grim realities of warfare. And today we've been installing the finds from the Tollens battlefield, which is one of the earliest battlefields in Europe. And there you see the grim reality of warfare. People who are bludgeoned with blunt objects rather than with swords. People who are not wearing armor, that are just wearing textiles and whatever they can grab. So the warrior identity, the beautiful warrior, versus the grim sort of humanity of war, the grim reality of warfare between individuals. We don't want to end there. We don't want to close the narrative on a negative note. We want to show how the house comes, the community house, the village, becomes the focus of activity after monuments like Stonehenge cease to be that sort of fulcrum or central point. And we're really lucky and grateful to Cambridge Archaeological Unit, Historic England, and to Peterborough Museum, that we're able to show some of the key finds from Musk Farm for the first time to make that point about the home. The astonishing half-dead axe that might have been a foundation deposit, those little beautiful bobbins of textile, metal, woven textile on dogwood sticks, the beads that have been traded in across Europe to Britain, showing both the local ingenuity as well as the connectedness of these people at this time in the story. And then very finally, when people leave the show, they'll see a new acquisition by the British Museum, which has been up in Shrewsbury on its holidays for a temporary exhibition there, where it was shown first. I'm really grateful that we were able to do that, able to show this new acquisition up close to where it was found first. And it will form the conclusion of the exhibition, because it sums up so much of what we've been talking about throughout the cycle. It sums up the sophistication of these people. It sums up the collectivity, because this object is closely connected to what's happening in Ireland and indeed possibly the Mediterranean world. But also it sums up this focus on the sun. To our eyes, if you flip this object, it's a little rising or a setting sun. So it sums up all of those things, but it also was deposited around 800 BC, at the point we close our narrative. And it really does feel that that is a coherent cultural moment of change, as iron starts to come into Britain and as the cultures of that time start to change and go in new directions and ultimately lead to all sorts of astonishing new archaeological manifestations. But it's a good place for our narrative to end. So I'll leave it there. I realize I've run over, but I'll leave it there. And I'm again really grateful to be able to share some of these objects with you. And I really hope that as many people as possible can make it down and see the exhibition, and that it acts as a kind of stimulus for the British Museum's engagement with the CBA and with archaeology more generally. And something that I think is really a huge area of potential, and something that myself and my colleagues, people like Sophia Adams, are really keen to pursue even more in the future. So I'll stop sharing there, and thank you very much for your attention.